everybody. Can you hear me? Wow, this is an incredible crowd. This is, I come to the library about once a week, and I've never really appreciated this magnificent atrium as much as I have tonight. So already the ideas are percolating, and we're going to do our best to follow that extraordinary performance. We're going to be a little more earthbound, but hopefully we'll be able to inspire some ideas and might soar a bit. Anyway, the subject tonight is what will San Francisco, or what should San Francisco look like in 2030? A modest question for which we will impart the definitive answer. But obviously, when you think about the future of the city, one of the most difficult, challenging, salient, and controversial topics, and one that everybody here probably has their own personal spin on, is housing. And so we're going to focus on the housing piece of this aspect of the city's future. And Randy Shaw has long experience as the founder of the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, which many of you know provided and provides hundreds, if not thousands, of units for the city's most vulnerable population, mostly in the Tenderloin. But Randy's an idiosyncratic thinker and has broken with some progressives on this subject, and this is one of the reasons the subject's so interesting, because he's written a new book that's called Generation Priced Out. I think you'll get some sense of what that book is about from the title, but I'll let Randy describe the book and how it came to him and the thesis of the book. So take it away, Randy.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you all for coming, and thank the French Embassy and the main library for inviting us all to this incredible event. Thank you all.
Yes, hear, hear.
You know, I did write this book, Generation Priced Out, Who Gets to Live in the New Urban America? Because when you think of the topic of our panel, what kind of city will San Francisco be in 2030? A lot of you may think, oh, the way things are going, it's just going to be the rich and the subsidized poor. How many of you think that? Middle class leaving the city right now, right? Well, that's why I wrote this book, because it explains how we can reverse that and have a different vision. And I'm actually very optimistic, and I'll tell you what my vision looks like. Over half this city, the buildable land, you can only build a mansion, a 40-foot tall mansion in the whole west side of San Francisco. Does that make any sense to any of us? How about building apartments, fourplexes, 10-unit buildings that are more affordable to the working and middle class? Doesn't that make common sense? So when I think of 2030, I think of a San Francisco that has legalized apartments citywide. You can build apartments not just in the Mission, in the Tenderloin, and South of Market, but in every neighborhood. And that means working people, middle-class people will have housing they can afford where they currently can't afford mansions. And what that means, when you have more people living on the west side of the city, you have to invest more in what? Transit. How many of you took Muni to get here? Glad you made it. Glad you made it. But you know, we need to do a better job of transit, and housing and transit are interrelated. But the key thing is, we can't make San Francisco an inclusive city economically or through racial diversity if we don't build more housing. And any of you here, hey, I thought development causes gentrification. Look at Bernal Heights, look at Noe Valley, look at the Haight-Ashbury. Nothing's been built there in 30 years, and they all are super expensive elite enclaves. If you bought a house there in 1970 and 1980s, lucky for you. Only rich people can afford the $2 million sales price now. So we have to build more apartments in even the gentrified neighborhoods to give opportunities for diverse and the kind of San Francisco I think all of you really want. So we're going to take questions after Gary and I speak, but I hope all of you can buy into this vision of legalizing apartments citywide and an economically diverse San Francisco in 2030. Thank you.
So the classic pushback to what Randy just said, which is a position I tend to share myself, but I've had many, often extremely heated arguments with close friends on this subject. And the pushback, which is not easily dismissed, goes like this. What the vision that Randy laid out is a classic market supply and demand vision. If you have an incredible amount of demand, if you have an incredible amount of demand, you have to increase supply or prices will be stratospheric. Now that's generally true in markets. The argument made against this by this interesting combination of NIMBY homeowners and dyed-in-the-wool progressives is that the demand is so great here that no matter how much we build, we will never significantly drop the prices. Now, I put this question to Supervisor Scott, former supervisor, now state senator Scott Wiener, and his comeback, because he is a big proponent of increasing housing of all sorts, whether subsidized or market rate, and especially near transit centers. And his argument was simply this, says, look, we've never really tried to build at the level that could begin to drop prices. We only began to add significant units in the last 3 or 4 years, and even those units are far below the demand. So I think that was an interesting comeback. But Randy, I'd be curious, I'm sure you've had this argument with people, and I'm curious to know what you think about it.
You know, I always find it curious. People in Noe Valley, where I used to live, always say, exactly, the demand's so high, why build more? It won't satisfy the total demand. But if you're someone who has to commute, as 120,000 people are commuting, 120,000 people commute every day from Sacramento to the Bay Area because they can't afford to live closer. That's great for greenhouse gas emissions, isn't it? That's great for the battle against climate change. So if you don't build in Noe Valley, you're basically saying commute an hour in a car. And in San Francisco, 20 to 25% of all new housing must be affordable. So people say, well, 75% is not affordable, but if you're part of that 25%, it sure beats the commute from Sacramento, don't you think? So we have to aim high, and unfortunately, the greatest job in San Francisco is being a homeowner in one of those neighborhoods, because you make $60,000 a year in increased equity just by preventing anything from being built. So I make all the arguments in the book, Generation Priced Out. It involves many cities, because it's not just San Francisco. All across America, Los Angeles, Austin, Minneapolis, Denver, Seattle, Portland. Vast stretches of the city are mansions only. They bar apartments, which makes no sense. It's this anti-renter attitude, and when you ban apartments, you're basically saying you have to be rich enough to buy a house to live in this city. And that has never been what San Francisco has always been about. We've been an inclusive city. We need to keep being inclusive.
And the other key element, I think, here is that Randy touched on it in passing just then, but this is not a problem that San Francisco can solve by itself. We're not, by far, even the worst offenders. We actually build somewhat more housing, bad as we are, than a lot of suburban communities whose attitude is, oh, you know, we don't do housing. We just provide jobs down here on the peninsula. And we have these beautiful little suburban towns, and God forbid that we should ever build in them. The sort of poster child for this, that is the most egregious, is this charming, lovely little hilly town called called Brisbane, which is just south of South San Francisco. Now, no one is suggesting that we suddenly upzone those hilly, charming streets of Brisbane, but there's this enormous flatlands, the Bay Flatlands, that's 600 acres or something. It's about the biggest area easily built on land. It's old Southern Pacific land. And the city of Brisbane has repeatedly refused to allow any housing to be built there. So these are all interconnected issues where we need, and unfortunately, we don't have regional governance that has any enforcement teeth. We have a regional system of government called ABAG, but they basically can't do very much. So every town, every city has got to, take this bit by the teeth, and this is something that a lot of young people in particular, I think, are beginning to get involved with the so-called YIMBY movement, which means yes in my backyard. And for many years, progressives would dismiss YIMBYs as pawns of developers. A lot of it comes from this deep and understandable in many ways, I think, ideological opposition to profit. If somebody's making money on this, this has got to be bad. I grew up in Berkeley, and this is dyed in the wool there. Any development prima facie is bad. Well, that's kind of simplistic thinking. Simply doesn't work, because we can't do it all by affordable or by what's something called below market rate, which is a very important concept. People throw around the word affordable housing, and Randy knows a lot about this. What affordable doesn't mean anything. What affordable housing is subsidized housing, and most of it, as Randy alluded to in his opening remarks, goes to the very poor. Well, I'm not here to argue that we shouldn't be doing that, but the amount of units that go to middle-class people, which is called below market rate housing, is a tiny fraction. It's like 3,000 to 4,000 units that we have of this. These are the kind of units that most of us might like to live in, where you could get a 2-bedroom apartment for $2,500 if you win the lottery. Well, good luck winning the lottery. It's not a realistic option. And in fact, even if it became a realistic option, this is a really interesting thought experiment. What if San Francisco became like Sweden, where we had basically socialized housing? That would be fantastic in one way, but hey, and that's my larger point is, this is a national issue. We need housing for everyone. That was in the National Housing Act of 1949. They said every American deserves a decent house and a good environment to live in, and we have abjectly failed to live up to that, and San Francisco can't solve that problem by itself, but so it's a national issue.
San Francisco is going to be a far more economically inclusive city than it is today. And maybe we should take some questions.
Just one more point that I'd like to make, Randy, which is another major piece of this, in my mind, is the role of the big tech companies as opposed to the tech workers, of whom I'm sure there are many here tonight. The big tech companies have in effect become de facto governments in terms of their economic power. And I think that they actually, and Mark Benioff, the head of Salesforce, is a really fine example of the way to begin of tech companies really rolling up their sleeves and saying, okay, yes, we're driving the economy, this is a good thing. Only a Luddite would say that we should go back to the 9% unemployment that we had before the tech boom. But by the same token, clearly the mass numbers of extremely, well-paid people, the average salary in San Francisco now is over $100,000. And the tech companies need to step forward and help with housing and help with transit and help with everything. And some of them are not good actors. I think Amazon has not been a good actor. I think these traveling road show, how much money will you give me, the richest man in the world? I think this is outrageous. And we need more Benioffs and less Amazons, but I think that's a huge piece going forward also.
Let me just mention, I describe in my book how when 2012 happened and the second tech boom and rents were driving up and home prices, unfortunately in San Francisco, so many of the boomer homeowners were blaming the tech worker, the folks who came out of college owning $100,000 in debt, the folks paying $3,500 for a one-bedroom apartment. They were blamed for the crisis instead of the companies and the cities like Cupertino, which don't build any housing, or Palo Alto, which just approved its first affordable housing project in 8 years. Palo Alto, yes, they finally did it. I mean, really. So the tech cities have to require the tech companies to provide the housing for their workers, so otherwise we all pay the price. So let's start taking questions. Who has a question about anything we've said? Go right ahead.
Hi, regarding housing the homeless, rather than playing the sympathy card, would it be a good idea to communicate to the business class and the wealthy class that getting homeless people off the streets and into housing?
I got it. I'll repeat it. You want to know getting the business class to deal with homelessness?
Well, my point is that it would be a good idea to communicate that getting homeless people off the streets and into housing is good for business and good for tourism.
That's what Mark Benioff's been saying. That's why we won on Prop C in San Francisco, because he convinced the business community. I completely agree with you.
I'm in agreement with you that we do need more housing, but I feel a little concerned who's going to be building these apartments, and will it create a bunch of forever renters?
It's one of the greatest places in the world to live, and it's on a peninsula surrounded by water. So a lot of experts I've spoken to, while they agree with the sort of thesis we have tonight of building more housing, there's a pretty cogent argument to be made that ownership may be difficult because it's going to be hard to bring prices down that much, and even renting, if you're a teacher and we don't subsidize your salary and you continue, and let's say you're making $80,000, that's borderline. It's even no matter how much we build, that could still be problematic simply by the nature of this city. So I think we have to get used to a certain amount of this being a rich city. I completely agree with Randy. We want to do everything in our power to make it less that way, but I don't think we're going to completely win that battle, to tell you the truth.
Next question. Yeah.
There's a lot of units in the city that are empty because people have a second home, or a lot of people have a rent-controlled apartment, then they move in with their girlfriend or their boyfriend and they keep that apartment, they sublet it, or they decide it's their office or something. How do you deal with that? Well, how do we get those back on the market and available?
To be really honest with you, I call it the myth of the vacant unit. There really aren't that many vacant units. People want to, there really aren't, and it's really overstated. I mean, there are in Vancouver and New York City and the $10 million, $20 million condos, a lot of vacant units in Vancouver and New York City. Some of the high-rise luxury, but that's not why we have a housing shortage.
Yeah. One point I just want to follow up on about rent control that I will throw out there for everyone to think about, just because it's really interesting, especially if we begin to have more universally subsidized housing. I think people will start looking at rent control, which I think is necessary now under the current circumstances, but they'll go, wow, we're solving a public problem on the backs of private individuals, and we're letting people game the system. So that if we start subsidizing at a more universal level, you will start hearing more legitimate calls for means testing on rent control, which does get gamed. It may not get gamed at a huge level. But I think this is something that's going to be an interesting issue in the future.
I will predict right now, you can write this down, there will never be means testing of rent control in San Francisco. Take that to the bank.
So I'd like to address what you just said, Randy, about unoccupied units, because Spur said in 2014 that there were between 20 and 30,000 unoccupied units in San Francisco, residential units that were owned by foreign capital or domestic capital or parking their money there and not renting the units out. And now that was Spur that said that, so I'd like to know where you got your statistics from on that.
I'd like to know where they got their statistics from, that there's 20,000 vacant units. So we had a thing in the mayoral election where one of the candidates said there were 1,000 vacant SROs available for the homeless. Completely false. Completely false. And yeah, I mean, often units aren't finished. There's a lot of reasons units are vacant because there was a fire. You know, there's a lot of factors, but this is not a surprise to anyone. Landlords are in the business of trying to make money, and you make money by filling your units.
Yeah, and one point, John, on that is there are only 185,000 housing units in the city. So 20,000 would be extraordinary. You know? Yeah, right, yeah.
Next question. Anybody other? Yes, back there, right there. Yes. Speak up.
I'm concerned about the structural integrity of the housing that is being built and the locations of which they're being built. The idea of liquefaction, not understanding exactly how our buildings will hold up during a severe earthquake. And also the architecture. For me, I've been here since the mid-'80s, but I've been coming here since the '60s. And the architecture has dramatically changed. And while some people might feel it's wonderful, some of the old charm, to me, maybe I'm just old-fashioned, it's disappearing. And there are cement slabs going up where there used to be detail, which gave it the charm that I came here for. So
well, I have to say,
those are my areas of concern.
I have to say, I think all those cement block refrigerator high-rises were built in the 80s. So in downtown. So there's a lot of bad buildings that have been going on for decades here, I think. Anyway.
Yeah, just my take on that is that I agree. There's a lot of shoddy modern architecture. There's a lot of sort of bad Lego buildings that are cheaply made. They don't have good claddings on them. The colors are vulgar, and you know, they're just not good buildings. There's also quite a few good ones. So, and if you look at the architecture that came out in the '60s, often it's really bad. You know. There are plenty of older buildings, yes, but if you start looking back at some of the really detailed older buildings, you know, they were far more expensive to build. So it's a trade-off, you know. Like if you go back to, you know, the beautiful old terracotta, and you know, the old office buildings are magnificent. But
any other questions? Yes, right here, right there, gentleman, right there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I haven't read your book, so I don't know all the aspects of the argument, but I'd like to go back to the supply and demand argument. So you're saying that if there's an increase in the supply of housing in the city, that the equilibrium price will fall, that people will be able to afford it. My question is twofold. First of all, how do you imagine that taking place without government regulation on pricing? And then my second one is, the demand for housing isn't constant, it's continually increasing, specifically with economic growth and companies in San Francisco, and so how do you imagine that happening without government?
Let me answer the first part of your question, and it's really a fact that probably when you guys, most of you came here tonight, probably didn't know that in half of San Francisco, you can't build a triplex, that we have reserved most of our city for mansions. How many people knew that before they came here tonight? A handful, but some of you, that's good. But I mean, you're probably thinking, so we're talking about building housing. You wonder why San Francisco doesn't build more housing. Well, you can't build it on vast stretches of the city. And that's why our supply never meets our rising jobs and population growth. Same thing with Los Angeles, which added 1 million people since 1970, but they have vast stretches of Los Angeles that's zoned with a 20-foot height limit for a single-family home. Now that makes no sense, but you agree, and that's government regulation. It's called our zoning laws. So government has been regulating. You can never just build your way out of the housing crisis. Never. But not building has failed.